Hello and welcome. I'm Asima Katauka and you're watching America 360 on News 6 World. Let's take a look at some of the headlines of this hour. Canadian Foreign Minister Anita Anand and Chinese counterpart Wang Yi have met in Beijing to address long-standing trade disputes over canola and electric vehicles. Both sides have stressed the need for regular and candid communication amid tensions following China's anti-dumping duties on Canadian canola and Canada's 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Greek authorities have found the bodies of 2 women on the island of Chios after a makeshift boat carrying 29 migrants have met with an accident today. The tragedy highlights the ongoing danger of migrant crossings in the Aegean Sea. The Kremlin has said that many questions must be resolved before a planned Trump-Putin meeting in Hungary, while Russia has claimed new battlefield gains in eastern Ukraine, announcing the capture of Pischane and Taiki in Kharkiv and Privilya in the Dnipropetrovsk areas Ukraine had earlier recaptured 3 years ago. The Kremlin has said that many questions must be resolved before a planned Putin summit in Hungary, while Russia has claimed new battlefield gains in eastern Ukraine, announcing the capture of few regions, areas Ukraine had recaptured 3 years ago. The United States and Brazil have stated that they aim to arrange a meeting between President Donald Trump and President Lula da Silva as soon as possible after positive trade talks in Washington. The discussions were attended by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Trade Representative Greer, and Brazilian Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira. Chinese exporters are shifting away from the U.S. market amid tariffs and trade tensions, with many saying that they have given up on American buyers. Despite the disruption, China's exports have rose 7.1% to $2.8 trillion in the first 9 months of this year, as companies turn to other regions in the world to offset U.S. losses. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton has been criminally indicted by a Maryland grand jury on federal charges related to the mishandling of classified information, making him the 3rd Trump opponent charged in recent weeks. The 76-year-old faces up to 10 years in prison per count as he vows to prove his innocence. British Petroleum has said a fire has been extinguished at its refinery in Indiana, the largest in the U.S. Midwest, after reports that multiple units were offline and the facility was actively flaring early today. BP has confirmed sirens and flaring were part of safety measures, but has not disclosed the current operational status of the refinery. Now we start from U.S. John Bolton, the national security hawk and former advisor to President Donald Trump, who has become one of the U.S. president's biggest critics, is set to make an initial appearance in court on charges that he mishandled classified information. Bolton is the 3rd of Trump's prominent critics to face prosecution in recent weeks, as the U.S. president dispenses with decades-long norms designed to insulate federal law enforcement from political pressures. The indictment alleges that Bolton shared sensitive information with 2 of his relatives for possible use in a book he was writing, including notes on intelligence briefings and meetings with senior government officials and foreign leaders. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Andrew Latham. He's a professor of international relations, joins us live from Minneapolis. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, what does John Bolton's indictment signal about this current administration's approach to handling classified information, also political dissent within its own ranks?
Well, it's a good question. There are 2 ways of answering it. One of which is this is just business as usual. John Bolton, on the face of it, is clearly in violation of federal secrecy laws. and should be prosecuted as anybody else would be. On the other hand, though, it appears to be part of an emerging pattern in which a long-standing taboo, if I can use that word, against prosecuting one's political adversaries has been in place in the United States, and President Trump seems to be eroding that particular guardrail, shall we say. So it remains to be seen. If the jury and the judge acquit themselves professionally and in keeping with the norms of American jurisprudence, Bolton will be found guilty or not guilty on the merits of the case. But it's got to have a chilling effect either way. The message that the administration is sending is, don't mess with us, or you might find yourself on the wrong end of a lawsuit.
And how might this persecution of Bolton and other prominent critics impact the norms surrounding the independence of federal law enforcement and the politicization of the justice in U.S.?
Right. Well, there are three discrete branches, and there's meant to be a balance of power amongst them, between them. There's the legislature, Congress. There's the administration, which is the White House and all the federal agencies. And then there's the judiciary, which is meant to be the courts, and they're meant to be all independent. To the extent that we see an erosion of the independence of the judiciary under this administration, and not just this administration, but especially this administration, it's a worrying trend. It's worrying because it threatens to undermine the political system and the constitutional political system, but it also raises questions for individuals, private citizens, who maybe strayed to the wrong side of a particular issue and again find themselves on the wrong end of a lawsuit. So it can have a chilling effect both politically but beyond that. For our purposes today, I think it's the political chilling effect that's really concerning.
With that, I would like to thank Professor Andrew for joining us and sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, Kremlin has announced today that a summit between President Vladimir Putin and President Trump could take place within the next 2 weeks or later, though much remains to be worked out before a date can be confirmed. The two leaders have agreed to hold a second summit on the war in Ukraine, potentially in Budapest. The announcement comes just ahead of a planned meeting between President Putin and President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, amid reports that Washington is considering supplying Kyiv with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has stated that key diplomatic figures, including Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, will need to coordinate on various issues before the summit. Both Russia and Ukraine continue to blame each other for hindering a peaceful resolution. Additionally, President Putin held a phone call with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban to discuss Hungary's readiness to host this summit. Now, for this discussion, we go back to Professor Andrew Latham. He's a professor of international relations, joins us live from Minneapolis. Thank you very much, Professor, for staying with us. Now, looking at Budapest, this particular location, how plausible is that Budapest could host a Putin-Trump summit, given Hungary's legal obligations under Rome Statute and the existing ICC arrest warrant against Putin? Professor, are you muted? Okay, yeah, I can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. It is the only conceivable European capital in which such a summit could take place. Orban, of course, Prime Minister Orban is trying to triangulate, as it were. He's trying to be equidistant from Washington and Moscow in all of this, even though Hungary is part of the European Union and NATO. He's willing to turn a blind eye to the Rome Statute and not enforce the arrest warrant should Vladimir Putin show up for this summit as a diplomatic courtesy, as a diplomatic gesture, and as a means of advancing Hungary's interest in seeing a peaceful resolution to this, because Hungary is under incredible pressure, on the one hand from Moscow, on the other hand from Washington and Brussels. And the sooner this war is over from Hungary's perspective, the better for Hungary it will be, hence Orban's willingness to host the summit.
And what does this EU support for this meeting reveal about its current strategy and priorities regarding conflict resolution and engagement with Russia and the United States?
I think at one level, everybody knows that it's a slow, grinding war, but it's unfolding in Russia's favor. Russia's making incremental gains. Here and there, the Ukrainians make successful counterattacks, but generally speaking, the Russians are making slow, grinding, incremental progress. And that means, from a European perspective, as well as Ukrainian perspective, they need peace. They need this war to end. And the question is, what are they willing to give the Russians to buy them off, as it were, or to threaten the Russians? Hence the Tomahawk missiles being on the table. The Tomahawk missiles, should the U.S. turn them over to Ukraine, would significantly enhance Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russia, against its oil infrastructure, etc. So that threat's on the table. Any peace process is going to have to be verifiable. It's going to have to more or less freeze the lines in place. It'll be more of a Korean-style ceasefire, I think, than a permanent peace. But the Korean ceasefire has lasted for, 80 years now? So that's not a bad outcome. But that's where we are. Everybody wants this to end. They want it to end on their terms. They're likely to accept a second-best outcome rather than an optimal outcome.
And lastly, how might this proposed summit influence the trajectory of Russia-Ukraine conflict and also today's talk between President Zelensky and Trump?
Well, it's of a piece. On the one hand, Trump would like to show up in Budapest, if that's where it takes place, and say to President Putin, look, if you don't agree to terms which are quite favorable to you, even though you don't get everything you want, we're going to turn over these even more advanced weapons to Ukraine, and they're going to inflict more pain on you, undermine your economy even further. Do you really want that? And then it's up to Putin and the people around him to decide, have we achieved enough for the time being that we can call a ceasefire? Or do we think we can still, if we hang in there a little bit longer, gain everything that we want? And Trump's job, and the Europeans' job, but Trump's job in particular, is to drive home the point that you cannot get everything you want. Things will get much worse for you if you continue this war. Accept the win, as it were, and let's call an end to this conflict.
Thank you, Professor Andrew, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we stay on this topic. Mixed reactions are emerging in Moscow over the possibility of a second summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump. Aimed at ending the war with Ukraine, the two leaders agreed to meet again, tentatively in Budapest after their first meeting in Alaska in August. Let's listen in to what some of them have said.
Дай бог, чтобы все кончилось мирно, и типа, может быть, даже специальная военная операция подошла к своему логическому завершению, чтобы цели были достигнуты нашей стороной, ну, в основном нашей стороной. Вот. Ну и как бы украинская сторона, ну, наконец-то перестала принимать в этом участие, в этом бессмысленном, как бы.
Ну, слушайте, на любую силу есть своя сила. Поэтому Путин с ним и договорился. Нельзя Россию запугивать вот этими ракетами. На эти ракеты у нас есть свои ракеты.
По-моему, уже очевидно, что это какая-то будничная новость. На мой взгляд, это просто одна из встреч, созвонов, так что не знаю, ничего не жду.
Now for this discussion, we go back to Professor Andrew Latham. He's a professor of international relations, joins us live from Minneapolis. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, how do you analyze current Ukraine-US-Russia's relationship?
Well, it tends to swing back and forth in this way. President Trump and his administration sometimes think that if they curry favor, as it were, with Moscow, they can bring this to an end. And then President Trump is frustrated because Vladimir Putin won't go along with what he wants. And then the pendulum swings the other way, and President Trump very much favors Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian prime minister. And so we go back and forth. I think the pendulum is swinging less wildly than it has been in the past, because I think President Trump thinks he's close to bringing the two parties together to some kind of negotiated ceasefire, if not permanent peace. But there's no long-term commitment, I think, on the part of the Trump administration to either Russia or Ukraine. There's just, to use the term that's often used with respect to the president, this transactional approach. I will say and do whatever is necessary to get them both to the table and to agree to something which ends the war and reflects favorably on American diplomacy and perhaps Donald Trump's diplomacy in particular.
And Professor, since we already know that Ukraine wants to get, or what is in the list for President Zelensky in talks with President Trump, what do you think President Trump has in his list of to discuss with President Zelensky?
Well, the things that are being fought over are territory and long-range strikes. And there's a humanitarian dimension to this as well in terms of prisoner exchanges and bodies being exchanged and things like that. So there are a number of items on the agenda that have to be negotiated and agreed. The big one, I think, though, is the question of borders. President Putin is not willing to settle at the moment for less than his maximalist aim of all of Donbass plus. And Volodymyr Zelensky is unable to concede that, either in terms of nationalist narrative or in terms of domestic political coalitions and constituencies. He can't appear to be the loser of this war. And so we have Scylla and Charybdis, as it were, a rock and a hard place. And the longer this war goes on, though, the more inclined both parties will be to say that the pain now exceeds the benefit. Perhaps we should simply concede. We can't get everything we want, but we can hold on to what we have, and that might be good enough in the short to medium term.
And lastly, how might this proposed summit influence the trajectory of Russia-Ukraine conflict, especially considering broader geopolitical stakes involved?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm even guardedly optimistic. I think this is likely to be more theater. I think we're not quite there yet in terms of the pain point on both sides in Kyiv and Moscow. I think this war will have to grind on a little bit longer. But at least the diplomatic table is being set. There are going to be, if not this particular opportunity, future opportunities convened by the American president that will allow these two combatants to get together and say, okay, finally we've had enough. But I wouldn't expect too much out of this particular, if it happens in Budapest, this Budapest summit.
And also I wanted to ask your reaction about this particular location, Budapest. Why Budapest? Why Hungary?
Well, because Orban, the head of government there, is, even though Hungary is part of the European Union and NATO, he's not terribly favorably inclined towards the Ukrainian cause here, and is more favorably inclined towards the Russian cause. And so kind of an intermediary. He kind of straddles both camps, as it were. And also he's made promises that he won't, in violation of the Rome Treaty, he won't execute any ICC warrants against President Putin should he show up. And he's one of the few European leaders, he might be the only European leader who's made such a commitment. So I can't see this summit happening in Berlin or Warsaw or London or Paris. I can see it happening in Budapest, only in Budapest.
And what about, why not Turkey? Last time it was in Turkey. What do you think, why is it not in Turkey this time?
Turkey's another remote possibility, although nobody's mooted it at this point. It hasn't been raised as a live option. Turkey's a bit on the outs with Washington at the moment for a different set of reasons. But it too, even though it's a member of NATO, and part of it at least is clearly in Europe, it kind of straddles both camps as well, and has, as you said, very early in this war hosted a peace summit and a process, but that fizzled out, and so Orban has stepped up, and it looks like Hungary is now the center of gravity when it comes to these kind of summits.
With that, I would like to thank Professor Andrew Latham for joining us and sharing that insight throughout this topic. Now we move on to our next news. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has stated that the United States has, for the first time, openly acknowledged carrying out CIA operations in Venezuela. Speaking at an event in Caracas, Maduro has accused the CIA of previously plotting against both former President Hugo Chavez and himself. Earlier, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Iván Gil also said that they viewed the CIA authorization from Trump administration with an alarm, stating that such maneuvers aim to legitimize a regime change operation and ultimately intends to seize Venezuela's oil resources. This came as a recent U.S. strike targeted an alleged drug vessel in the Caribbean. The U.S. military strikes on suspected drug boats off of Venezuela's coast on October 14th reportedly killed at least 27 people. In response, Venezuela has called on the United Nations Security Council to declare the U.S. strikes illegal and to issue a statement affirming Venezuela's sovereignty. Let's listen into what Venezuelan president has said.
El gobierno de Estados Unidos decide mandar a la CIA para Venezuela. ¿Ustedes vieron la noticia? Autorizaron que la CIA haga operaciones contra Venezuela, contra la paz de Venezuela. Eso nunca se había visto. Siempre lo han hecho. Siempre lo han hecho, pero jamás ningún gobierno anterior desde que la CIA existe dijo públicamente que mandaba a la CIA a matar, a derrocar y a acabar a los países.
Now we move on to our next news. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that the IMF should strengthen its surveillance activities, including on China. He has urged the World Bank to end support for China and redirect funds to countries with greater needs. Bessent has stressed that both institutions need more budget discipline and should freeze senior salaries. He has noted that there is no consensus on realigning shareholdings at the World Bank and expects the 2025 review to conclude without changes. Bessent has further added that future IMF governance talks must be based on new quota formula. He has reaffirmed that the IMF has adequate resources and that the U.S. remains committed to the 16th quota review. Now for this discussion, we're joined by John Rossomando. He's a president of Viking Research Associates and geopolitical analyst, joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, John, for joining us again. Good to see you. John, what's your reaction towards this Bessent's comments about IMF?
Well, I think that he's looking at the fact that China is now the second largest economy in the world. It's become the central hub for global manufacturing. It doesn't need support from the World Bank or the IMF anymore. Plus, also, talking about China's involvement, with supporting Russia's war effort. So, from that perspective, the IMF is therefore, indirectly supporting the Russian war effort.
And currently still China holds, a status as developing country. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think that it should be regarded as a developing country any longer. I mean, its economy is larger than practically every other economy except for the United States. So we should be holding China to the same standards that we hold other developed countries. I mean, you have, very stark differences between the coasts and areas inland, but China is very much a developed country.
And also looking back at Scott Bessent's comments, how realistic is his proposal to end World Bank support for China and redirect funds to more needed countries who need them? Also, what about the senior positions salary increase?
Well, I think that China has a lot of leverage at the UN, World Bank, and I'm doubtful that anything will change because it's in China's interest to keep the money coming.
You mentioned that you doubt about the changes. What do you think? What are the challenges that IMF faces in achieving consensus and reforms on these realignments, especially with emerging economies like China?
Well, I think that the challenge you have is like bureaucratic will. The Chinese have an extreme amount of influence with these countries that are participants in the IMF, World Bank, to rig the game in its favor.
And how might this calls for budget discipline and freezing senior salaries, IMF and World Bank affect effectiveness and credibility of these institutions?
Well, everyone has to live within their means, so this is a good way of trying to restore confidence in the World Bank and in the IMF as reliable institutions for lending in the developing world.
Thank you very much, John, for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on to Africa. Madagascar's coup leader, Colonel Michael Randrianirina, was sworn in as a president with cheers, blaring trumpets and raised swords days after taking control of the island nation in the wake of youth-led protests that has forced out his predecessor. Let's listen into what Randrianirina has said.
J'ai expliqué ça plusieurs fois. Parce qu'il y a un point qui marche à Madagascar, il n'y a pas de président, il n'y a pas de président du Sénat, il n'y a pas de gouvernement, il n'y a rien qui marche. Donc, on doit prendre la responsabilité du fait.
Meanwhile, the ex-leader Andry Rajoelina, whom the lawmakers impeached after he fled aboard at the weekend, has condemned to the takeover and refused to step down while in exile, despite widespread defections in the security forces and the High Constitutional Court ratifying the army takeover within hours of it happening. And that's a wrap on America 360. Keep watching News 6 World for more news updates from around the world.